Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I am Dr. Claudia Albers, Planet X researcher and professional physicist, and today I'd like to bring to you another one of my articles. This one is entitled Life Extinction, Planet X and Fukushima. Now, on March 11, 2011, a large earthquake and tsunami just off the coast of Japan led to the largest ever nuclear disaster on Earth. And it was at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. And this power plant had 6 nuclear reactors. 3 were in operation and 3 were shut down and awaiting refueling. And the 3 operating reactors automatically shut down at the time of the earthquake, as was expected. But the tsunami then damaged the emergency generators designed to power cooling in case of a power failure. And since even shut down, the fuel rods in the reactors require circulation of cooling water, without the power, these overheated. This led to meltdowns in all 3 reactors and the release of radioactive compounds into the atmosphere and into the ground. And in addition, a pool containing spent fuel rods in the reactor 4 building also overheated, thus leading to more releases. And we see here a picture of the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant in Japan on March 11, 2011. And we see there an explosion. This seems to be due to the release of hydrogen, which occurs when overheating occurs inside the reactor. And this power plant uses boiling water nuclear reactors, and these were designed by General Motors. And these reactors produce heat from nuclear fission and is passed on to water, which runs steam turbines and then turns electrical generators to generate electricity. And because of the need for water to cool the reactors, the spent rods, and also is used as a moderator, and a moderator is a material used to slow down neutrons and thus maintain controlled fission. And these power plants are usually built near coastlines. So they are vulnerable to tsunamis, as was the case here. Now, it was already known in 1975 that the containment vessels used in these nuclear reactors were not strong enough and could tear in the case of coolant loss, which could lead to uncontrolled release of radiation. And in fact, in 1976, 3 scientists resigned from General Motors as a result of this design issue. They were not safe, but they continued to use them until this happened in 2011. And this is an image, a diagram of the reactors. It's made up of a steel vessel. It's under pressure, I think to 75 atmospheres. And it contains fuel rod assemblies that are placed inside the reactor. And it contains these control rods. These control rods are neutron absorbers. And when placed in position, they stop the reaction. If they are inserted partially, they just slow it down. But these are the control rods that must have been inserted when the reactors were shut down at the time of the earthquake. Now, and as you can see, there's water. Water comes in, goes into the reactor, acts as a coolant and moderator, and it goes out, it creates steam, and from there it generates electricity. Now, the fuel used in the reactor was enriched uranium, except for reactor 3, which had a mixture of enriched uranium and plutonium. And the fuel rods, these fuel rods are 13 feet long, and they contain pellets made out of uranium, except for the ones in reactor 3 that had plutonium in them. And now natural uranium contains about 0.7% uranium-235. And uranium-235 is the isotope which leads to the most energy or heat release due to the fission. The rest of the uranium is uranium-238. However, the uranium in fuel rods is usually enriched with uranium-235, so that they contain 3 to 5% uranium-235. Then during the nuclear reactions inside the reactor, some of the uranium-238 gets converted to plutonium-239, which then fissions as well, thus also providing some of the heat. It provides about a third of the heat released due to the fission reactions. Then 85% of the reactions lead to fission into lighter nuclei and several neutrons. And the lighter nuclei are usually krypton and barium, but it can lead to other ones. And about 15% leads to the release of gamma rays. 15% of the fission reactions. Sorry, not the nuclear capture reactions, because this is what happens. Neutrons always start the initial reaction. They are captured. So uranium-235 becomes uranium-236. It still has 92 protons, but it gains 1 neutron. The number of protons tell us that it's still uranium, but it's now slightly heavy. It contains 1 more neutron. Then uranium-236 fissions, or some of it fissions, about 85% fissions into lighter fragments. And these fragments interact with atoms in the environment and ionizes them, which means they get turned into positive ions and free electrons. And these then recombine into neutral atoms, which leads to the release of heat. Now, the problem is that plutonium is extremely dangerous because only tiny amounts, if it gets inside a human body, for example, if it gets into a person's lungs, that person is extremely likely to get lung cancer. And the Fukushima disaster released, and it continues to release, it is not contained, into the environment radioactive isotopes. And these isotopes are different forms of a certain natural atom with different numbers of neutrons in the nucleus. Some of these isotopes are extremely long-lived. For example, neodymium-144 has a half-life of 2.3 times 10 to the 15 years. That's 2.3 quadrillion years. And this means that it will never be gone. And as long as it is around, it will continue to decay. And it decays into cerium-140, which is stable, and therefore ends the process. But the decay process from neodymium-144 to cerium-140 is alpha decay. And this involves the release of an alpha particle, which is a helium nucleus. And also to the release of gamma radiation. Now, the helium nucleus is not very damaging as long as it is outside the body. As it is, it can be shielded by a piece of paper because it's very heavy and it's positively charged, so it reacts easily with any material it encounters. So if outside the body, it does not actually penetrate very far into the skin, so it's not a real problem. The problem is when it is deposited in the body or when it's ingested. And when it does that, it repeatedly bombards nearby tissue, leading to mutations and destruction of cells. And that, in that way, because it's so heavy, it's extremely damaging to that tissue it has been deposited in. And plutonium-239 is an alpha radiation emitter. In other words, it also emits helium nuclei. But it is extremely hazardous if ingested, because it's a very strong carcinogen. And only a tiny amount, say about 30 micrograms, which is 1/1,000,000th of an ounce, when it enters a person's lung, that person is almost certain to get lung cancer. And on top of that, it seems to be absorbed mainly into soft tissues once it enters the body. So it has a tendency to go to places like the liver or the bone marrow, which are extremely susceptible to this kind of radiation. And also, we cannot live without our liver or our bone marrow. So it often leads to cancer and death. Now, gamma rays are also released when radioactive isotopes decay, and gamma rays are very difficult to shield against because they are photons, they have no charge, and they therefore do not react easily with material they encounter. They are extremely damaging to living organisms, and they do not have to be inside the body because they can easily penetrate through the skin into the interior of the body. And gamma radiation is also ionizing, that is, it knocks electrons out of atoms, which means they become ions and we have free electrons. And this causes what's called oxidation, the breaking of molecular bonds, and ultimately the destruction of cells' DNA, and therefore the destruction of cells. And when large number of cells die, we can get organ failure and death may result. And then another possible outcome is mutations in the cell's DNA, which may lead to cancer and ultimately death. And here we see a rabbit which was born without ears, and this rabbit was found in the Fukushima region after the nuclear disaster, which demonstrates the fact that the released radiation is leading to genetic mutations. Now, other isotopes are also released. Some of them do not have such extremely long half-lives, but they are also extremely damaging. For example, iodine-131 has a half-life of only 8 days. But this does not mean that it is gone in 8 days, only that the amount present in the environment halves in 8 days. But because we have ongoing release happening from Fukushima, this compound continues to spread and accumulate in the environment. And exposure to iodine-131 leads to thyroid cancer. Then another compound with a reasonably long half-life is cesium-137, which has a half-life of 30 years. And this compound will therefore spread around the world and continue to release gamma radiation as it decays. Cesium-137 causes genetic mutations in both humans and animals. So eating food contaminated with this radioactive element can lead to cancer and or deformities in developing babies. And at the moment, there is no known way to stop the release of alpha, beta, and gamma radiation as a result of decaying radioactive isotopes. The beta radiation is the release of a high-energy electron, and when a neutron decays into a proton and an electron. Beta decay can be quite damaging to living tissue, but not nearly as damaging as gamma radiation or as alpha radiation inside the body. Now, after the Chernobyl accident, which happened on April 26, 1986, everyone should have known better than to continue to build nuclear power plants. In fact, that they should have known better before they even started. But because the dangers were known before then, it was well known that before any nuclear reactor reactor was built that if something went wrong and radioactive isotopes were released, that the effects could not be reversed. The Chernobyl disaster was not actually nearly as bad as the Fukushima disaster, as after the initial meltdown it was possible to build a concrete barrier around the Chernobyl reactor which contained the radiation. However, Fukushima is not contained. It continues to release radioactive compounds into the atmosphere, into groundwater, and into the ocean. Now, this shows that there has been an increasing trend in cancer-related deaths since the 1950s. And this is likely to be connected to the radioactive compounds released into the environment due to nuclear weapons testing, which started around that time. But the release of radiation into the environment actually started, with this nuclear weapons testing, was not as bad or nearly as bad as what was released by Fukushima. And this is according to a report from 2013, which stated that the release from Fukushima up to that time had been 100,000 times greater in terms of the cesium-137 that it released than either Chernobyl or the nuclear weapons testing. And so the release of radioactivity, as I said before, was likely, that started with nuclear weapons testing, was likely to be the most important factor in the steady climbing rate of cancer deaths since the 1950s. And of course, the 1950s was when nuclear weapons testing fallout started. And here we actually see a diagram that explains the amount of radiation. The yellow is the amount of radiation in terms of cesium-137 that was released during nuclear weapons testing. The orange is what was released by Chernobyl in 1986. And this is weapons testing by the 1960s. And this is Fukushima. Oh, okay, I said in November, but it's actually only the release measured from March to July 2011. And this was 100,000 times greater. As you can see, the top here, it's about 1,000. The top here, and this is in becquerels per cubic meter, is 100 million. So this is 100,000 times greater than this level here of 1,000. And it does vary from 100,000 to 100 million, the Fukushima release. And this was only from March to July 2011, just a few months. And you can imagine what has happened since then, because it has continued. There is continuous release of radioactive water into the Pacific Ocean, and there is continuous release of radioactive water into the ground below the reactors. They talked about an ice water barrier, but it is known now that it failed. Water is going into the groundwater in Japan and contaminating everything. Now, when radioactive compounds are released into the ocean, they are very quickly taken up by the smallest organisms like algae, plankton, the bottom feeders. And so the water is quickly cleared of most of the radiation, but it is then stored in the organisms at the bottom of the food chain. And thus, the radioactivity accumulates in these organisms, and this is called bioaccumulation. But then we get what's called biomagnification, because these organisms are eaten by other organisms, which are eaten by other organisms. And at each step in the food chain, the amount of radioactivity is compounded, in other words, biomagnified. So this is how it goes. If we measure the radioactivity in ocean water soon after the release, it may be quite low. But the radioactivity of algae, plankton, in that water may be 2,000 times higher. Then if you measure the radioactivity of birds eating the plankton, that may be 40,000 times higher. And if you measure that of birds eating insects which feed on the plankton, it may be, say, 500 times higher. And then if you measure the concentration in egg yolks in the eggs laid by these birds, it may be 1,000,000 times higher. And since human beings are at the very top of the food chain, human beings will receive, of course, the highest dose. Now you see here, these are plankton, these are organisms which live in the Earth's large bodies of water. They cannot swim against the current. Some are microscopic in size, such as bacteria and algae, but others are larger, like jellyfish. And certain large aquatic organisms are dependent on the plankton as it is their food supply, for example, some whales. But plankton is also the bottom of the food chain for most of the fish in the oceans. And research has shown that the release of radioactive compounds leads to impaired growth and reproduction in marine life. And this can lead to massive die-offs as a result, because the death of organisms at the bottom of the food chain leads to animals higher up on the food chain starving to death. And it's probably for this reason that the Pacific Ocean has been reported to be a dead ocean. And this has been reported by the Scottish yachtsman Urbain LeVerrier. And he sailed the Pacific Ocean before and after the Fukushima nuclear disaster. And he said that it was teeming with life before, but after, there was no fish, no birds, just silence, to the point that it haunted him. And here we see 10,000, part of the 10,000 of dead sea lions that washed up in California in December of 2014. Massive die-offs are happening. And have been happening since 2011, actually. Now, the problem got so bad with sardines that sardine fishing was banned in 2015 for the first time in 30 years due to the fishing population having collapsed. And part of the ocean, 150 miles off the coast of California, that had before the disaster been covered in, less than 1% of it had been covered in dead marine life, was 2 years later, in 2013, 98% covered in dead marine life. And this shows you how this disaster has destroyed the life that the organisms that were alive in the Pacific Ocean. So this has killed almost everything in that ocean. So it's no wonder it's reported to be a dead ocean. Now, massive die-offs have also been reported along the west coast of the United States. Tidal pools are now empty of life. Dead starfish are often found. Dead otters wash up on shore. And no clams are often found when they should be found, and where. Now, one naturalist has reported that she felt like she was doing nothing but counting dead animals. And here we see huge amounts of dead jellyfish on Baja, California in 2015. So the Pacific Ocean appears to have died due to the Fukushima disaster, but this will not end there, because the release of radiation into the atmosphere and the ocean continues, and therefore it will eventually spread to all land masses and all oceans. So it seems that the planet is in the midst of an extinction level event as a result of this disaster. Note, too, that 50% of the planet's oxygen supplied is supplied by algae and phytoplankton. And the world's phytoplankton has dropped by 40% since 1950. Also, we see that oxygen supplies worldwide have dropped from 21% to 19%. And the reason for this seems to be due to the fact that low-dose radiation causes global oxygen depletion through the killing of all oxygen-producing life forms, as these life forms seem to be particularly sensitive to radioactive contamination. Now we see here an image of phytoplankton, and these are microscopic photosynthesizing organisms or plants which inhabit most of the Earth's bodies of water. And they are the basis of the marine food chain. They also produce 50% of the planet's oxygen supply. So when they are gone, the marine food chain will be broken and all the oceans will be dead. And the planet will be running out of oxygen. And this oxygen, I'd like to add, also leads to the production of ozone. So this is another way that all life on Earth will be killed, because ozone protects us from high energy ultraviolet light, and without it all life on Earth will die too. So radioactive contamination is extremely long-lived and irreversible, and it is leading to the extinction of all life on Earth. As humans are on the top of the food chain, we cannot avoid this contamination and its long-term effects in terms of cancer and reproductive problems. The extinction process started with nuclear weapons testing, but ever since Fukushima, it has accelerated an extreme pace, and it's likely that in 20 to 30 years there will be just about no life left on this planet. As a result, Earth is therefore becoming a desert planet, much like Mars. However, Scott and I have been showing for many months that the solar system has been invaded by Planet X objects or stellar cores, and that these objects are affecting the Earth and the Sun, and all leading to a great increase in seismic activity, which, by the way, is very often underreported. Just about always, and often not reported at all. And the way we know this is because local reporting agencies often report a huge amount of these earthquakes, which never show up on the USGS maps. So it's likely this kind of seismic activity is likely to further accelerate this extinction event. And the reason for that is because we are likely to have tsunamis. And since there are nuclear power stations on every continent and usually close to the oceans because they require large quantities of water, it is of course inevitable that a tsunami and a repeat of what happened in Japan repeats itself over and over, thus accelerating the speed with which the extinction of all life will be reached. In conclusion, the Fukushima disaster was an extinction-level event, which is likely to lead to the end of life on Earth in 20 to 30 years. However, because of the presence of the Planet X objects, which are rejuvenating and increasing in number, and are negatively impacting planet Earth, mainly through increased seismic activity, and since there are so many nuclear power stations worldwide, this extinction event is set to accelerate its pace in the very near future. Now, I'd like to point out that the Planet X objects by themselves would not do this if there was no use of fission technology on Earth, and there was no weapons testing either. So, what can we do about it? We need to realize who is really responsible for the state of affairs, and the one responsible is a former archangel called Lucifer, who rebelled against the creator of all. He is the prince of the power of the air, and he places thoughts in human beings' minds and has driven them to use fission technology and into using nuclear weapons. which is meant to lead to life extinction on this planet. He is the one who causes war and has done what we see happening on our planet before. There is evidence that nuclear weapons were used on both Mars and on Earth in ancient times. He has used war to destroy countless civilizations, which is why the solar system is full of ruined cities and wrecks of countless spaceships. It is likely that he has done the same thing across the galaxy. The angelic beings who pretend to be aliens work for Lucifer and have the same aim as he does, to destroy all life on this planet. They have from ancient times worked to teach mankind what is evil and what will lead to our destruction. Our only hope is our Creator and Savior, Jesus Christ. We need to turn him, ask him to forgive us, and hand the course of our lives to him. If we do not do this, Lucifer will continue to use us as a conduit to do what he plans to do on this planet, which is to destroy it completely. Remember that Jesus said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." Standing for the truth is standing for and with him. He is the source of eternal life, the abundant, joyful, and peaceable life that goes on forever and ever. We need him. Now, these are my references if anyone is interested. And this is Dr. Claudia Albers, Planet X physicist. Thank you for watching.